My name is Laurel. I'm 25 years old, and last spring, I nearly died in a hospital hallway while my father told the nurse I was faking it. I remember the exact moment it started, the tightness in my chest, the burning in my lungs, the way the floor swam beneath my feet. I had been trying to explain the sensation to doctors for months, years even, but nothing ever showed up on tests. And when medicine doesn't see it, people stop believing it's real, especially people like my father. He stood there, pressed shirt, polished shoes, the same stone-cut expression he wore at business meetings and family dinners, and told a nurse, "She just wants attention. Don't indulge her." And I would have died. I honestly think I might have, if my aunt hadn't leaned in and whispered the truth into that nurse's ear. Whatever she said made the nurse's entire demeanor change. Suddenly, I wasn't an inconvenience on a gurney. I was a patient. I was a person. And that tiny shift saved my life. If you're still listening right now, I want you to do something. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one, and if you've ever had to fight to be heard, I hope this story brings you clarity and a little luck. It wasn't a dramatic collapse in the middle of a crowd or a tearful revelation at the dinner table. It was quieter than that, more insidious. I grew up in a house where pain was never valid unless it was visible. You could have a broken arm and they'd rush to the ER. But if your chest felt like it was caving in from anxiety or your breath vanished after climbing stairs, you were being dramatic. My father believed in strength above all else. He was a former college athlete, now a venture capitalist, and the kind of man who thought emotions were weaknesses to be trained out of you. He raised us like we were always on trial, performing to earn his nod of approval. And no matter how hard I tried, I always seemed to fall short. I was the fragile one, the one who cried too easily, caught too many colds, who had to sit out of gym class when my lungs tightened for reasons no one could explain. My mother floated somewhere in the middle, quiet, delicate, devoted to my father in ways that made her presence feel more ornamental than protective. And then there was my Aunt Celia, my mother's older sister, the black sheep, the family liability. She wore silver jewelry and taught art at a community college, and my father loathed her with a passive-aggressive precision I hadn't understood until much later. But she saw me. She saw me at 9 years old, curled up in a ball on her couch after another unexplained fainting spell, and she didn't tell me to drink water or toughen up. She sat next to me and listened. No one else in my life did that. The symptoms got worse in my teens. I started waking up breathless, dizzy before meals, my heart racing during the most mundane moments. School nurses chalked it up to stress. Pediatricians tested me for asthma, anemia, allergies. Every time the results came back normal. My father used those results as proof that nothing was wrong. If I cried after a dizzy spell, he'd say I was turning a hangnail into a tragedy. And it worked. I started second-guessing myself. I learned to push through the episodes, to hide them, to shrink myself smaller than the pain. College gave me space. I studied environmental biology at a school 2 states away, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe, even if my lungs didn't always cooperate. I built a life outside my family's shadow. But flare-ups kept coming. Sometimes I couldn't get out of bed. Sometimes I woke up drenched in sweat with my heart racing like it had just run a marathon. One of those episodes hit while I was home for a weekend visit, an obligation I tried to avoid whenever I could. We were at a country club dinner. My father had made some generous donation to a scholarship fund and insisted the whole family attend the award presentation. I remember the chandeliers, the chilled shrimp cocktail, the way my chest began to cave in right before dessert. At first, I tried to breathe through it, then I tried to stand. I only made it 2 steps before everything tilted sideways. Someone gasped. A fork clattered to the floor. I crumpled in front of the dessert table, and even then, even as the world spun and my body fought for breath, I heard his voice cutting through it like ice. She's just doing this for attention. There was nothing left in me to fight with. I felt weightless, powerless, like a whisper that didn't make it past my lips. But I remember the look on the nurse's face when my aunt leaned in. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw the shift. That was the moment everything changed. Not the fall, not the gasp for air, but the whisper that turned someone's indifference into action. The nurse called for help. A doctor came running. I was lifted onto a gurney, rushed into a hallway, monitors placed, oxygen administered. I remember drifting in and out, the pulse of machines guiding me back to awareness. Someone held my hand. I think it was my aunt. And in that breath between consciousness and sleep, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Belief. Someone finally believed me. I woke up again in that same sterile hospital room. Not exactly rested, but aware of how fast life can slip away and how slowly the world can bring you back. I was tethered to 4 poles and monitors, the steady blinking a metronome I didn't ask to follow. My body felt foreign, like someone else's skin draped on my skeleton. I wasn't surprised when questions started again. How long did it last? Did anyone see it? Do you feel chest tightness elsewhere? But this time, I answered them with intent, trying to put flesh and bone to the invisible storm inside me. My aunt stayed, always stationed in that corner chair, eyes alert even in dozing moments. I'd spent most of my life fighting reassurance, believing that once someone recognized the panic in my body, they'd dismiss me. Weakness disguised as threat, but she sat there, not recoiling, not collapsing in judgment, just present. That presence made me believe the possibility of trust. By midday, the tests still hadn't revealed an obvious culprit. BP normal, lungs clear, ECG fine, but my pulse was roving. Unexplained arrhythmias that left the doctors talking in shifts of low voices on the other side of the curtain. They wanted more data. Holter monitor, tilt table test, neurological screening. I nodded and accepted referrals like I always had, silently terrified each appointment would end like the others. Clean report, another month of struggle. Alone. My discharge packet handed off by a nurse with kind eyes. I returned home under instructions. Manage stress, follow up, take this medication. The prescription was for a heart rate regulator, intended to slow whatever storm was surging inside me. I tucked it into my bedside drawer, unanswered. Weeks passed. I kept a symptom log. Time stamped. A dizzy spell as I peeled my blazer after work. A flutter ascending while I reached for a book's top shelf. Panic enveloped me in traffic. I scribbled each detail. I was sculpting my own medical history, brick by brick, until someone believed what I lived. At home, my father's messages came in rare pings on my phone. Glad you're discharged. Let me know if there's anything. But anything never included an apology, never an interim, never a question about the fear. I realized acceptance can be as isolating as disbelief. On a sudden impulse, I agreed to attend my cousin's engagement party. It felt like entering a facade of normalcy. My father greeted me with the same warm performance he gave everyone. Trust fund-sized smile, elegant posture. He didn't mention my collapse, not even a glance that followed me when I sat down. My aunt arrived later. She spotted me from across the garden with a slow nod, my secret signal of solidarity. She didn't mention hospitals, didn't shame me for making a scene. She simply sat next to me and took my hand. That touch carried more meaning than years of undelivered diagnoses. That night, I ended up on the terrace overlooking the garden lights, safe distance from polite conversation. My chest still heaved, the aftershock of panic lingering in my ribs. But the wind felt honest. The lawn smelled like cut grass and release. I thought of the log I kept, how it had grown into a map of my body's betrayals, and perhaps a path forward. I thought of my aunt's hand around mine, and how belief had made me less alone in that moment. When I returned home, I pulled the beta blocker from the drawer. I stared at it and decided not to consent to silence anymore. I tossed the packet into the recycling bin, not because I didn't need help, but because I needed the right help. I didn't want to diminish my body's voice. I wanted to amplify it. I called the cardiologist's office myself the next morning, clear, steady, requesting the tilt table test. The pulmonologist's office, the neurologist. I arranged the fastest available appointments. It felt like reclaiming agency. My first appointment came a week later. They put me under different lights and sensors, gave me time to articulate what months of white coat dismissal had taught me not to say. And then they said something I had only dared hope. Your baseline may look normal, but what you feel is real. We're going to find a reason. Loss of breath, dissociation, chest heaviness. It was all accounted for now. Not denial. Recognition. I left the clinic feeling slightly undone and wholly human. Back at home, I unloaded my experience into a clean journal page. No emotional guardrail. Just me and the quiet truth of my body's rebellion. My aunt came over a few days later. She didn't ask about test results. She didn't promise miracles. She said simply, "I knew you were real. You are real." That statement reverberated in me, echoed, and for the first time in a long time, I let the belief settle. A body's suffering is only real when someone listens, and until then, it can fold us in half. But acknowledgement can be medicine. Here I was in the middle of my illness, and for the first time, the illness didn't have to own me. There's something uniquely terrifying about losing control of your body while everyone else just watches. The second time I fainted, it happened at my cousin's birthday party. I remember the moment right before it, how the room blurred just slightly, how my hands started tingling, how my heartbeat crawled up into my throat like it was trying to escape. I tried to get someone's attention, but I could barely speak. The world folded inward in a soft, dizzy silence. I woke up to chaos. Voices raised, shoes shuffling on the floor, cold air rushing over my skin. I blinked into the ceiling fan above me, trying to remember where I was. My chest hurt. My limbs wouldn't obey. My aunt was crouched beside me, holding my wrist gently, feeling for my pulse. Everyone else stood around like I was an unpredictable firework. Someone had already called 911, but my father's voice cut through the noise like a blade. He wasn't angry in the way most people imagine anger. It was colder than that, dismissive, sharp. He told the paramedics I probably fainted from skipping breakfast, that I was always this dramatic, that I had spells for attention. The paramedic still insisted on checking my vitals. My blood pressure was low, my heart rate was erratic, and I was drenched in sweat despite the cool air. But once they saw I was responsive, they deferred to my father's authority. He made them feel silly for taking it seriously. Just dehydration, they nodded. Just nerves. That night, I cried in my room with the door locked. I didn't want anyone to see me unravel, not even my aunt. But she knocked quietly, waited until I opened the door, and didn't say a word. She just sat on the floor with me, her presence gentle and constant. The next day, she gave me a list of terms to look up: vasovagal syncope, POTS, autonomic dysfunction. She said she had once fainted the same way, years ago, and it had taken a long time for doctors to stop blaming it on stress or hormones. She encouraged me to keep a journal. She said patterns mattered more than symptoms when it came to getting people to listen. So I wrote everything down. Every dizzy spell, every racing heartbeat, every drop in blood pressure I could feel in my bones. I recorded what I ate, when I stood, how long it took to feel normal again. It was tedious. It was painful. It made me feel like a lab rat in my own life. But it also made the invisible real. And that mattered more than I knew. My father didn't stop mocking me. At dinner, he rolled his eyes when I asked for extra salt on my food, something I'd read might help stabilize my pressure. When I stood slowly, holding onto the table for balance, he called me theatrical. But I kept journaling anyway, because something was wrong and no one was going to save me if I didn't believe myself first. Eventually, my aunt convinced a new doctor to see me. She had a reputation for digging deeper, someone who didn't dismiss symptoms just because they were hard to categorize. I brought my journal to the appointment, every page full of shaky handwriting and charts and questions. The doctor read it carefully. She asked me how often I felt short of breath, how long my episodes lasted, whether I ever felt my vision go black. She didn't laugh. She didn't brush me off. Instead, she scheduled a tilt table test and some advanced autonomic testing. She said she suspected something real was happening, something my father had no interest in understanding. The tilt table test was uncomfortable. They strapped me to a padded surface and tilted it slowly until I was upright, monitoring my heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing the entire time. Within minutes, I started to sweat. The room tilted even though the table didn't. My legs felt like water. My vision pulsed at the edges. And just before I passed out, they caught the drop on the monitor, my body betraying itself in real time. It was relief and grief all at once. They called it neurocardiogenic syncope, another name for vasovagal episodes, but now it had weight behind it. Documentation, a clinical code. Something they couldn't dismiss as just anxiety or drama or a teenage girl needing attention. My body had spoken clearly, finally. I left that appointment with a packet of information and a new plan: salt tablets, compression garments, hydration goals, medications to help stabilize my system. But more than that, I left with validation, with proof that I wasn't making it up. My aunt cried when I told her, not because she was sad, but because she knew how long I'd carried the weight of disbelief, how long I'd lived with the ache of not being believed. My father didn't say much when I showed him the diagnosis. He skimmed the paperwork, shrugged, and said something like, "They'll give a name to anything these days." But I didn't need his approval anymore. I had something stronger. I had the truth. And for the first time, I believed that was enough. From the outside, I had a good life. A big house with a manicured lawn, private school, 2 cars in the driveway. My clothes were never secondhand, my lunches were never forgotten, and the refrigerator was always full. But none of that mattered inside the house, where being me came at a cost I learned to pay quietly. They used words like sensitive, emotional, unpredictable. When I cried too easily, it was drama. When I got overwhelmed at loud parties, it was just attention-seeking. When I fainted, when I couldn't breathe, when I clutched at my chest and said something wasn't right, well, that was me being difficult again. The truth is, I was terrified of my own body. It betrayed me without warning, spiraling into symptoms no one else could see. The fatigue was constant. My heart would thunder after walking up one flight of stairs. I'd get headaches that felt like lightning splitting my skull, then fall asleep in the middle of the day like I'd run a marathon. And yet, nothing ever showed up on the basic tests. So they stopped testing. They started blaming. My dad especially hated what he couldn't control, and he couldn't control me, not the way he controlled everything else. He'd slam cabinets when I asked to go back to the doctor. He'd mimic my posture when I had to sit down quickly, hand to my chest like I was in a play. "Oh, the vapors!" he'd shout, laughing. My mom would say nothing, her silence as loud as his cruelty. I used to think I could make them see me if I just said the right words, if I explained my pain the right way, if I smiled more through it. But that only made it worse, because in this house, pretending was the highest virtue, and I was never good at it. In school, I was quiet, but my grades were good. Not extraordinary like my cousin Alina's, who was already applying to Ivy League schools by junior year, but solid. Teachers liked me. I kept to myself. But even there, I was marked. If I needed to lie down in the nurse's office, I was faking. If I missed a day after fainting in the shower, I was one of those girls. The worst part wasn't the symptoms. It was the isolation. I was surrounded by people who loved the version of me that didn't exist, the easy, smiling girl who bounced back from everything. And every time I tried to be honest about what was happening inside my body, I lost a little more of their approval. Eventually, I stopped trying. I learned to manage on my own. Salty snacks in my backpack. A water bottle I refilled obsessively. Breathing exercises I practiced in secret. I wrote everything down, not just the physical symptoms, but the emotional toll, how it felt to disappear in plain sight, how it felt to be punished for pain I couldn't name. My aunt was the only one who saw the cracks. She'd pull me aside at family gatherings, ask real questions in quiet corners. She was the one who brought me to that first appointment where someone finally listened. But before that, she just listened herself. She didn't flinch when I told her how afraid I was. She didn't try to correct or minimize. She just believed me. There was one night, winter break of my sophomore year, when I collapsed after coming in from the snow. I'd been sledding with some neighborhood kids, trying to feel normal, and then I wasn't. I couldn't move. My vision blacked out. I was cold but sweating. My dad found me on the floor of the mudroom and said, "If you can stand up to go sledding, you can stand up now." He didn't help me. He just stepped over me. I told no one. I dragged myself up the stairs, locked myself in my room, and cried into my pillow until my chest hurt more than my legs. That was the night I started to plan my exit, not just from the house, but from the version of myself they kept trying to force me into. The version that didn't need help, that didn't faint, that didn't ask questions. I promised myself I'd leave as soon as I could. I'd get out, get answers, get free. But until then, I had to survive. So I kept journaling. I studied my body like a foreign language. I gave my pain names when no one else would. And slowly, I started to build a quiet kind of strength, the kind that doesn't look like power from the outside but is the only thing keeping you alive. They called me difficult, but what they really meant was, I refused to disappear. The year I turned 17, I became someone I barely recognized. Not because I changed, but because I finally realized just how much had always been hidden from me. There's a strange kind of grief in looking back and realizing your entire childhood was curated, manipulated, wrapped in layers of performance for appearance's sake. By then, I had become an expert at monitoring myself. I logged my symptoms in coded notebooks I kept under my mattress. I'd grown hyper-aware of every physical change. When the heart palpitations began, when the dizziness swelled behind my eyes like a wave about to break, when the numbness crawled up my arms like ivy. But I no longer told anyone. I just adjusted, adapted, endured. Meanwhile, my parents acted as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. My dad, especially, was in campaign mode, charming and composed, boasting about my achievements to his colleagues while privately brushing off my health as drama. He'd make jokes in front of family friends. You know, teenage girls, everything's life or death. And everyone would laugh, nod, agree. I learned to smile too, just enough not to cause trouble. But things were shifting beneath the surface. I started noticing my dad making more frequent hushed phone calls in his study. He'd close the door tightly, something he rarely bothered to do before. I caught glimpses of manila folders, files with labels I wasn't supposed to see. Once, I saw a document on his desk with my name at the top in bold letters. When I asked him about it, he said it was part of my college planning file. But it wasn't. I remember the heading clearly, patient observation summary. That night, I waited until they were asleep and crept back down to the study. The document was gone. But that was the beginning of my certainty that I was being watched. I started to test it. One afternoon, I pretended to faint in the hallway just outside his office door. Within 30 seconds, he appeared, panicked, wide-eyed, not to check on me, but to scan for witnesses. When he realized no one else had seen, his expression shifted back to cold irritation. "Cut the act," he said. "There's no audience here." I didn't respond. I just stared at him, let the silence stretch between us like a rope pulled taut. That was when I knew. Whatever was going on, it went beyond simple denial. He wasn't just trying to ignore my illness. He was tracking it, controlling the narrative. Around that time, my aunt started asking more pointed questions. She'd stopped accepting vague reassurances and started researching on her own. One weekend, she took me to lunch at a diner 2 towns over, away from everyone we knew. She slid a folded sheet of paper across the table to me. It was a list of specialists, names circled, notes written in the margins. She said, "You don't have to go through this alone anymore." I wanted to cry, but I didn't. I couldn't. I'd spent so long compartmentalizing my emotions just to survive that I wasn't sure how to let them out anymore. Instead, I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my bag like it was something sacred. I started sneaking to appointments when I could. I used my school lunch period, forged permission slips, made up club meetings. I began to build a case history of my symptoms. Several doctors suggested a neurological component. One mentioned dysautonomia, something I'd never heard of before but immediately recognized in myself when I looked it up later that night. I kept my findings hidden. I couldn't let my parents know, not until I had something concrete, undeniable. But even as I pieced things together in secret, my body kept breaking down. The episodes became more frequent, more intense. Some days I'd wake up with hands trembling too much to hold a pen. Other days, I'd nearly collapse walking up the stairs to class. The more I unraveled, the more it became clear that my health was only one part of a much larger pattern of control. My father had connections I never fully understood. He could call up favors, make records vanish, charm school administrators into silence. I realized he wasn't just dismissing my illness, he was managing the story, editing my reality like a script he thought only he had the right to write. But I wasn't the same girl I'd been at 15. I had started collecting evidence, not just medical but personal. I recorded conversations, photographed bruises, saved emails. It felt paranoid at first, but eventually it felt necessary. I wasn't just trying to survive anymore. I was preparing. For what, I didn't yet know. But something was coming. I could feel it in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. By the end of that year, I wasn't pretending anymore. Not in private. I didn't smile when I didn't feel like it. I didn't minimize my pain in my journal. I wrote what was true. My body was failing in ways I couldn't yet fix, but my will? That had never been sharper. They still called me difficult, but what they didn't see was that I was becoming dangerous. I was learning the truth, and soon I'd have enough of it to finally break free. I always believed my father's mask would never crack. He was too good at the performance, too composed in public, too meticulous behind the scenes. But every lie, every empire built on control and silence eventually shows a fracture. Mine came on an ordinary Thursday. That morning, I woke up with ringing in my ears so loud it felt like sirens were living in my skull. My limbs were heavy, stiff, and the nausea came in waves I couldn't hold back. I called out weakly, but no one came. When I finally managed to pull myself to the bathroom, I collapsed against the sink and vomited into the porcelain. My hands trembled so badly I couldn't twist the cap off my medication. I texted my aunt, just the word, bad. It was our code. She replied immediately, telling me she was on her way. But before she arrived, my father found me on the hallway floor. I was curled up, dizzy, sweating, the world spinning sideways. He stared down at me for a few long seconds. "You're not dying," he muttered, like it was a joke. Then louder, "Get up." I couldn't. I truly couldn't. My body was locked in panic, in pain. I tried to speak, but my words came out slurred. That's when I saw something shift in his eyes. Not concern, not fear, but calculation. He reached for his phone, called the nurse we'd been assigned through the insurance company. I remember his exact words. "She's playing it up again. You know how she gets. Just tell the doctor she's asking for attention." I felt something inside me go still. The nurse arrived before my aunt did. I could barely register the conversation, but I watched my father greet her like an old friend, like someone he'd already coached. They spoke in hushed tones as she knelt beside me, checking vitals with mechanical detachment. That's when my aunt walked in. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She just crouched beside the nurse and leaned in. I watched her whisper something so quiet I couldn't hear it, but I saw the nurse's eyes widen. I saw her posture change. She looked back at me differently, like she was seeing something real for the first time. The nurse asked to speak privately with my aunt. My father objected, but she ignored him. They disappeared into the other room, and when they returned, everything was different. The nurse insisted I be taken to the hospital. She said she'd seen enough. My father argued, but for the first time, his voice lacked conviction. The mask had slipped, and someone else had seen it. At the hospital, tests were ordered. Blood was drawn, fluids administered. And as I lay there, finally horizontal and away from the pressure of pretending, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. My aunt sat beside me, hand on mine, her silence louder than any speech. That night, the doctors didn't find a simple answer. They rarely did, but for once, they listened. They didn't accuse. They asked about my history, my symptoms. They believed me. When my father arrived, he brought flowers, as if that would erase the years, as if roses could smother memory. He smiled, too wide, too practiced. He asked how I was feeling, like a script he'd rehearsed, but I saw the flicker in his jaw when the doctor mentioned further tests, when they talked about neurological consults. When the nurse from earlier, now an advocate, suggested psychiatric follow-up not for me, but for evaluating the possibility of medical neglect. His eyes narrowed, just for a breath, and I realized then, he was scared. Not of me, but of what I was becoming. A story he couldn't control. Back at home, everything shifted. My aunt became my gatekeeper. She took over my appointments, coordinated my care. She started documenting things, photographing bruises, saving prescriptions, recording conversations. She was building a case, just like I had been in secret. But now, I wasn't alone in it. I watched my father retreat. Slowly at first, more meetings, more travel, but I knew it was a defense. He sensed the tide turning, the lie unraveling. That year, I began speaking to a counselor. I didn't tell her everything, not yet, but I started small. I talked about the anxiety, the physical symptoms, the pressure to perform. She asked if I felt safe at home. I told her it depended on who was in the room. I didn't need to say more. She understood. The more I spoke, the more I remembered. Things I'd buried deep, times I'd blacked out and been scolded afterward for embarrassing the family, the way my mother would flinch whenever my dad raised his voice, even if it wasn't at her. The quiet warnings hidden in my aunt's glances across the dinner table. None of this had started with my symptoms. It started with power, and now I was learning how to take mine back. That winter, my aunt told me she'd hired an attorney, not to sue, not yet, but to prepare. In case things escalate, she said gently. in case we need to protect you legally." I nodded, because by then I'd stopped hoping things would go back to normal. I didn't want normal anymore. I wanted truth. I wanted safety. I wanted a future where I didn't have to justify my pain or fight to be believed. The next chapter hadn't been written yet, but this time, I'd be the one holding the pen. Silence had become my survival strategy long before I ever realized it. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind that wraps you in comfort or stillness. This silence was sharp-edged, strategic, suffocating. It was the language my house was built in. If you didn't speak it, you weren't welcome. By 17, I had mastered it. At school, I was the girl who always had her homework done but never raised her hand. I knew how to vanish in plain sight. I could walk through hallways, sit in classrooms, exist without leaving a trace. That invisibility used to hurt, but eventually I realized it was a shield. If no one saw me, no one could ask questions. Because I was tired of questions. Tired of the way adults squinted at me like they were trying to read something written in a foreign language. Tired of doctors who spoke over me. Of teachers who assumed I was just another teenager faking sick to skip gym class. Of friends who slowly drifted away, unsure what to do with a girl who couldn't promise she'd show up or stay upright. At home, I kept to my room. I built a quiet little world inside it. Books stacked like walls, journals filled with scrawled timelines of my symptoms, playlists that knew my secrets better than anyone else. I found comfort in control, even if it was just organizing my pill bottles or tracking my episodes with color-coded markers. My aunt continued to fight for me behind the scenes. She handled the appointments, intercepted my father's interference, and started gently asking if I wanted to tell my story. Really, tell it. I wasn't ready. Not yet. Speaking would mean opening doors I'd spent my whole life locking. But I started writing it. Not just medical records or symptom logs. I wrote memories. I wrote moments I hadn't let myself process. I wrote about the time I passed out at a school assembly and woke up with my father's hand gripping my arm so tightly it left bruises. I wrote about how, when I told my mother, she said, "It was just the stress. You need to stop causing scenes." I wrote about how it felt to be told, again and again, that my pain was imaginary. When I couldn't find words for the worst parts, I drew. I mapped my body like a battlefield, circled the areas where the numbness settled, sketched out the sensation of breath slipping from my chest like steam. No one saw those pages, not even my aunt, but they were the beginning of me taking something back. The diagnosis still hadn't come. I was trapped in that gray space that so many of us know too well, the space where symptoms are real, but names are elusive. But my body didn't wait for clarity. The crashes kept coming, sometimes days apart, sometimes in quiet succession that left me gasping. I began to recognize the patterns, the subtle warnings. I became fluent in my own fragility, and still, my father pretended. He showed up for appearances, smiled at neighbors, hosted colleagues for dinner, but he stopped speaking directly to me unless he had to. I think my silence unnerved him. He was used to control, and he could never quite figure out what I knew. I knew enough. I knew that he had medical power of attorney over me until I turned 18. I knew that meant he could override treatment plans, suppress test results, control how much the world was allowed to see. But I also knew my 18th birthday was approaching. I had circled the date in red on every calendar I owned, not because I wanted to celebrate it, but because it was my finish line. After that, my voice would legally matter. After that, I could make choices without needing his permission. Freedom wasn't going to be handed to me. I had to survive until I could seize it, and I was surviving. Not just physically, but emotionally, quietly, on my own terms. I kept the peace when I had to, played the role, but inside, something was hardening. Not into cruelty, but into resolve. I started preparing. I made copies of every document related to my health. I scanned my journals, backed up audio files, sent encrypted emails to myself just in case. I was building more than a record. I was building proof. Proof that I had not imagined this. Proof that the gaslighting had been deliberate, that the silence wasn't just mine. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning truth, because the silence that once protected me had also kept me trapped. And if I wanted to heal, really heal, I had to break it. But not yet. Not until I was ready. Not until I was free. The day I turned 18, nothing exploded. No storm swept in. No dramatic declaration marked the shift. But I felt it in my bones, like a deep, quiet thud behind my ribs, a final door unlocking inside me. I could breathe a little deeper, even if my lungs still stuttered sometimes. That morning, I woke up in my aunt's guest room and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The sunlight slipped through the curtains like a whisper, and I thought about all the times I'd been told I was faking it, that my breathlessness was just anxiety, that my fatigue was laziness, that my collapse was attention-seeking. And now, legally, they couldn't say those things and make decisions for me. My aunt made pancakes. She didn't sing happy birthday. She didn't buy balloons. We just sat in the kitchen, our mugs warm in our hands. She knew I didn't want a celebration. I wanted autonomy. She handed me a folder. Inside were documents I'd already memorized: health power of attorney forms, updated insurance authorizations, consent releases. I signed them one by one. It felt ceremonial, my own quiet coronation into adulthood. Not the carefree version some people dreamed of, but a fierce, necessary freedom I had earned through pain. Then came the calls. Doctors, specialists. One by one, we reached out to reclaim what had been hidden, to reschedule tests that had been mysteriously canceled, to reopen referrals that had gone missing. The energy it took was enormous, but I was no longer a shadow in my own story. I had a name, a voice, a signature that mattered. The first breakthrough came 2 weeks later. A new neurologist, a woman this time, sharp-eyed and curious, sat across from me and said, "I believe you." Just those 3 words, but I felt them in my spine. I didn't cry. I didn't even exhale. I just nodded, like my body didn't trust relief yet. She didn't rush. She read my records, asked careful questions, tested my reflexes and coordination. She watched how my hands trembled when I tried to hold a pen too long. She ordered an autonomic function test and a tilt table exam, tests no one had ever bothered with before. Tests my father had previously deemed unnecessary. The results weren't normal. For the first time, I had data, real numbers, evidence. She called me a week later and said, "You're showing signs of a dysautonomia, most likely POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. But I want to rule out connective tissue disorders too. Ehlers-Danlos is often related." I sat in silence after I hung up. I should have been elated, but all I felt was exhaustion. Not because I didn't believe her, but because I'd been waiting so long for someone else to. That night, I opened my journal and wrote in big letters, "I'm not crazy. I'm not making this up. I'm not broken. I'm just misunderstood." The diagnosis wasn't a cure. It didn't erase the years of doubt or make my symptoms vanish. But it was something. A start. A frame around the chaos. And in that space, I began to rebuild. Physical therapy. Medication trials. A salt-heavy diet and more water than I thought a human could hold. I started to learn how to manage the crashes before they hit. How to live around the unpredictability without surrendering to it. And still, I kept my distance from my father. He called once, left a voicemail, said he heard I'd gotten a label and hoped this phase wouldn't define me forever, that he missed me, that I should come home. I didn't call back, but I kept the message. Not as a keepsake, as evidence. My aunt supported every decision I made. She never pushed me to forgive him. She didn't weaponize compassion. She let me be angry, let me grieve. And when the letters from his lawyer started arriving, some polite, others not so much, she got her own. The last time I saw my father was in a hospital waiting room. My cousin had appendicitis, and I happened to be there with my aunt when he arrived. He looked older, smaller, like the air had drained from him. When he saw me, he froze. Then he smiled. That smile, the one that used to make doctors believe him over me. I stood. I didn't say anything, just looked him dead in the eyes, and I turned and walked away. No scene, no screaming, just silence, my own kind now. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. Grief doesn't always arrive in the way you expect. Mine came soft and strange. It settled into my chest, not as sadness, but as a kind of numbness, a quiet after the storm. I had spent so many years fighting to be seen, to be heard, to simply exist without being questioned, that when the noise stopped, I didn't know what to do with the silence. Healing didn't start with fireworks or grand revelations. It started with small choices, like getting out of bed on a day when the fatigue clung like cement, like deciding to try a new medication even though the last 3 had made my heart race uncontrollably, like saying no to a family invitation that came with a side of manipulation. Some mornings, I watched the sunlight crawl across the floor of my aunt's guest room and thought, this is what safety feels like. Not because it was easy, but because it wasn't conditional. I didn't have to perform wellness or gratitude or obedience. I could just be. I began therapy with a trauma specialist who didn't flinch when I described how my father dismissed my symptoms. She didn't gasp when I told her about the time he yelled at me for collapsing in a grocery store. She simply said, "That must have been terrifying. Let's talk about how your nervous system remembers that." I cried more in those first 3 sessions than I had in years, not because she made me, but because someone finally held space for the weight I'd carried. Recovery wasn't linear. Some days I felt almost normal. I'd make breakfast, take a short walk, even laugh at something on TV. Other days I'd crumple from standing too fast, the blood draining from my head like someone pulled the plug. But slowly, I began to know my body in a new way. Not as a traitor, not as a battleground, but as a compass. It spoke in tremors and dizziness and rapid heartbeats. I started to listen, and in listening, I started to trust. I enrolled in online classes, 1 at first, then 2. Something gentle, something mine. Psychology and environmental ethics. I didn't know where it would lead, but it felt like taking back a future that had been paused. My aunt cheered every small milestone. When I passed my first exam, she made brownies. When I completed a full grocery trip without crashing, she called it a miracle. It wasn't, of course. It was progress. Slow, hard-won, mine. One afternoon, I found an old photo album tucked away in the back of a closet. Inside were pictures I didn't remember. Me as a toddler with chocolate on my face, building forts out of couch cushions, sleeping in my aunt's lap at some holiday I couldn't name. My father wasn't in most of them. My chest ached as I turned the pages, not because I missed him, but because I realized how much of my life had happened outside his gaze, how much joy and softness had been edited out of the story I'd been told. In therapy, I talked about that realization, about how abuse can make you question your memories, about how gaslighting fractures not just your trust in others, but in yourself. My therapist said, "The fact that you're remembering differently now means your brain is healing. It's safe enough to feel the truth." So I kept writing things down. Little truths, tiny triumphs, days when my pulse held steady and days when it didn't. Nights I slept without nightmares. The first time I took a shower without needing to sit down halfway through. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. Not to doctors, not to my father, not even to myself. I was just documenting a life that belonged to me again. Sophia, my older cousin, started joining me for weekly lunches. She'd gone no contact with her own mother years ago, and we bonded over the strange grief that comes from being the difficult daughter, the one who tells the truth and pays the price. "You know," she said once over soup, "they always made me feel like I was too much, too emotional, too intense, too needy. But maybe I was just honest, and maybe that scared them." I nodded, my eyes stinging. I knew exactly what she meant. Eventually, my therapist suggested writing a letter to my father, not to send, just to write. I put it off for weeks, but one night, when the wind howled outside and the house felt too quiet, I sat down and picked up a pen. The words came slowly at first, then all at once. I told him everything: how it felt to be told I was faking, how it shattered something in me every time he rolled his eyes at my pain, how I spent years trying to earn kindness that should have been mine without conditions. I ended the letter like this: "You don't get to define me anymore. I'm not your disappointment. I'm not your burden. I'm a survivor of your denial, and I'm finally free." I folded it neatly, slipped it into a drawer, and then I exhaled. That night, I slept through until morning. It was the first full night in almost 2 years. I never thought I'd say this, but healing doesn't feel like a thunderstorm. It feels like the moment just after it ends: quiet, damp, honest. You look around and nothing is untouched, but there's light coming through. That's where I live now, in that fragile, clear space between what was and what could be. It took me longer than I expected to feel safe again. Not physically, though that part still had its moments. I mean emotionally. It's strange how you can survive something traumatic, something that shakes your foundations, and yet the aftershocks don't come with sirens. They come when you're brushing your teeth, or trying to pick a cereal in the grocery store, or laughing at a movie and suddenly feeling guilty for enjoying anything at all. But I kept going. Some of the hardest work I did was in silence, just waking up and choosing to try again, getting dressed even if I didn't have anywhere to go, sitting in the sun with a cup of tea instead of hiding under my covers. Little rebellions against the voice in my head that still sometimes sounded like my dad's: sharp, skeptical, full of judgment. There were setbacks. Days where my body felt like it was made of glass and air. Nights where I wondered if I'd ever fully trust people again. I still flinched when my phone buzzed unexpectedly. I still struggled to explain to new friends why certain questions made me freeze up. But there was growth too. Real, tender growth. I started volunteering at a local community center. Nothing huge, just a few hours a week helping with an art class for kids. But there was something healing in watching their unfiltered joy. Something about how they scribbled stories in crayon like every color mattered. It reminded me that I still had stories to tell too. I journaled every night even when I didn't want to. I wrote letters to myself at 10, at 15, at 20. I apologized to the version of me that believed she was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. I told her she was never the problem. She was just trying to survive in a world that kept telling her to shrink. I wrote a letter to my aunt, too, the one who whispered the truth when it mattered most. I didn't have the words back then to thank her properly, but I do now. She saw what no one else wanted to see, and she believed me when it counted. I think that belief might have saved my life. Eventually, I made a decision. I didn't want my father's voice to be the loudest one in my head anymore. So I started therapy. I picked a therapist who didn't flinch when I said the word abuse, who didn't minimize the medical neglect I experienced, who helped me untangle the mess of shame and anger and confusion that had built up over years. In one session, I remember saying, "I keep trying to make sense of why he hated me so much." And she gently corrected me. "Maybe it wasn't hate. Maybe it was fear. Because you didn't play the part. Because you saw through him. That can be terrifying to someone who needs control. That reframing shifted everything. It didn't excuse what he did, but it released me from the responsibility of carrying it. I wasn't broken. I was just free in a house that didn't allow freedom. That realization gave me the courage to make one more big choice. I moved, not just out of my aunt's guest room, but into a tiny apartment of my own across town. It wasn't glamorous. The walls were thin and the fridge made weird noises. But it was mine. Every dish, every pillow, every book on the shelf, I chose them. For the first time, my space felt like a reflection of me, not a stage set for someone else's expectations. I started studying again. Slowly, one online class at a time. Psychology and creative writing. It felt good to stretch my mind, to learn for the sake of learning, not because someone demanded excellence, but because I was curious again. And in that curiosity, I found something unexpected. Hope. Not the loud kind, not the kind that dances on tables, but the quiet kind that sneaks up on you in the middle of a sentence and makes you realize you're smiling without even noticing. There are still scars. Of course there are. Some memories burn too deep to vanish completely, but they don't own me anymore. They're just part of the terrain I've walked through. I've stopped trying to rewrite my past. Instead, I've started authoring my future. And maybe that's what this whole journey has been about. Not proving I was right, not getting some dramatic justice, not even getting an apology that will never come, but reclaiming the pen, writing myself back into my own story, and knowing deep in my bones that surviving wasn't the end. It was the beginning. If this story touched something in you, please like and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and your story matters here. Who knows? Maybe today's the day you start writing your own chapter. You're not alone.